Um, Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to join you today in this session. I'll go ahead and start the presentation. While I'm presenting, I can't see the camera, so if anybody has questions, please feel free to unmute and interrupt me. But I plan this to be around maybe 40 minutes, more or less, worth of presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. So without any further ado, here we go. So I titled this Resilience-Based Economic Development, Some MMT Insights. And I'll start the presentation with a very brief introduction to the MMT approach, modern monetary theory, which some of you may be already familiar with, but just to get us started on some basic concepts. And then we'll see what we can do in terms of understanding some of the structural weaknesses that developing countries struggle with, understand some of the challenges that we're dealing with, especially on the climate front, and recognizing that the climate challenges and the economic development challenges are actually interlinked, and that the solutions, the policy prescriptions, are also interlinked. Hence the idea of resilience as a foundation for an alternative approach to economic development. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and start with some basic MMT insights, modern monetary theory. One of the key concepts that's extremely important for us to understand when we talk about economic development in the context of MMT is the idea of the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, recognizing that different countries have different degrees of monetary sovereignty, and I'll show some examples later. We have on this end of the spectrum some countries who have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever, and on the other extreme end, some countries with a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. The majority of developing countries are somewhere in between. So the question is, what determines the degree of monetary sovereignty, and why is this important? Well, the importance of monetary sovereignty, because the higher degree of monetary sovereignty allows the country to have a larger fiscal policy space to tackle national priorities, whether it's poverty, health, education, fighting climate change, and doing so without or before hitting the inflation constraint, which I'll come back to. So examples of countries that have no monetary sovereignty, countries that lost or never acquired any degree of monetary sovereignty. If you think of Ecuador, a country that dollarized its economy, doesn't issue a national currency, that's an example of a country with no monetary sovereignty. If you think of countries like the United States or Japan, that would be countries with a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. So what defines the level of monetary sovereignty are the following 4 bullet points that I'll highlight here. So a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty is a country that issues its own national currency. That's the easiest part of the monetary sovereignty concept here. Most countries can do this. It's a country that collects taxes in the same national currency. That's also typical of most countries, although some countries choose to opt for a foreign currency as their national currency, like I mentioned Ecuador in a minute. But the 3rd and 4th bullet points here become extremely important for the majority of developing countries. So a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty is a country that doesn't need to issue bonds denominated in foreign currencies. So a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty doesn't issue debt denominated in foreign currencies. Think of Japan, for example, the country with the highest level of debt to GDP ratio, but it has a very high degree of monetary sovereignty because the entire debt stock of the Japanese government is denominated in Japanese yen, the national currency. Same thing for the US, same thing for other countries with a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. And I'll come back to this, why this point is important. Point number 4 is related to number 3, which is a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty doesn't need to fix its exchange rate to the dollar or to the euro or to any foreign currency. Now, when I usually present this, sometimes the audience or the readers would immediately jump to a false conclusion, which is a developing country with a low degree of monetary sovereignty can simply declare that it will no longer issue debt in foreign currencies, that it will no longer fix its exchange rate, and all of a sudden it becomes a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty. That is absolutely wrong. What I'm arguing here is that there is a specific set of public policies that need to be implemented in order for a country to acquire a high degree of monetary sovereignty. In other words, you don't declare your monetary sovereignty, you earn it, you acquire it via strategic policies. And my focus will be on these strategic policies. So in other words, a developing country can just say, well, you know what, we're defaulting on our foreign debt and we're never issuing any debt denominated in foreign currencies. We're going to float the exchange rate, but we're not going to do any strategic investments in order to strengthen our monetary sovereignty. So that's really important to recognize. An important distinction, therefore, in the MMT framework is between the currency issuer, that is the national government, versus currency users, you and I, companies, foreign countries. So the users of the currency operate in under different sets of rules. In other words, the issue of the currency has a certain degree of fiscal policy space, a certain level of deficit that it can afford to have that the rest of us users of the currency can't have. Users of the currency have to work hard, earn an income in order to spend it. If we decide to spend beyond our monthly income, for example, we can borrow money from a bank, from a friend, from any other institution. But once we borrow, we have a debt burden that needs to be paid off. And the only way to pay it off is either by earning more income or reducing spending or doing both. But the debt burden for currency users becomes a real constraint, a real financial constraint. Whereas the currency issuer, anything that's available for sale in the national currency is technically affordable. The real constraint becomes not the financial constraint, but becomes the inflation constraint, which I'll talk about in a minute. So that's a key concept here. Don't try this at home. The MMT analysis is mostly focused on the currency issuer and how a currency issuer, a sovereign currency issuer, can acquire a higher degree of monetary sovereignty, therefore a larger fiscal policy space over time without facing bankruptcy, without facing the ultimate constraint, which is the inflation constraint. So let's take a step back and look at some of the structural issues that most developing countries deal with. And from there, we'll be able to put the two together. So structural trade deficits is a typical problem, the external constraint for developing countries that leads to high external debt. And here I emphasize external debt, meaning debt denominated in dollars and euros and British pound, Japanese yen, and so on, not to be confused with the component of the national debt that's denominated in the national currency. That is a separate issue. So here we focus on the external debt constraint. And if you start looking at the major root causes, and here I'm generalizing for the majority of developing countries, you find three major structural deficiencies. Number one is energy deficit. Number two is food deficit. And number three is low value added industrialization. Excuse me. And here, what I mean by energy deficit, here I include also countries that are major exporters of fossil fuel, like Nigeria, like Brazil, like Mexico, even like Saudi Arabia. You have plenty of fossil fuels to export, and yet you have an energy deficit in the sense that you don't have enough refining capacity to extract the petrochemicals that you actually need for your internal economic development. Think of Mexico, for example, a major oil producer that imports 50% of its gasoline from the US. So you end up exporting the crude raw material, in other words, and you're importing the higher value added product, the gasoline in this case. So food deficits This is typical for the majority of developing countries. May not be the case of Brazil, and I'll explain why. But if you think of the African continent, the most fertile land on the planet, you can argue historically, right after independence in the 1950s and 60s, Europe introduced a common agricultural policy, CAP, which was designed to reverse the roles between Africa and Europe in terms of who's producing what and who's dependent on whom. During the colonial times, Europe was dependent on agricultural output from Africa and other parts of the world, and that became an issue of national security for European countries. So CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, was introduced in 1962 specifically to heavily subsidize European agriculture in key strategic areas of producing corn and wheat and barley and core staples, to a point where producers in Africa were no longer able to compete globally with heavily subsidized European farmers. By the way, Europe was not the only bloc that did this. The Soviet Union did the same, hence Russia and the Ukraine role in food and the food system. The US did the same, Japan did the same, Canada did the same, Australia, and so on. And to a secondary degree, countries like Brazil and Argentina led in that space. And as a result, we created a food dependency issue. Today, Africa imports 85% of its food. So we have the point here is that you can't have a functional economy without food, without energy. And these are key building blocks that most developing countries have either never acquired or have lost because of these strategic policies that the global north has introduced in the 50s and 60s. And then low value added industrialization means that we essentially specialize in assembly line type of manufacturing. You import the capital, you import the intermediate goods, you import the energy and the technology, and you use low cost labor racing to the bottom, competing with other developing countries to attract foreign direct investment, to attract manufacturing units to do the assembly line work, and then you export low value added content. So you import high value added, you export low value added. It's a trap you never get out of without strategic transformative investments. So these three structural deficiencies lead to structural trade deficits. And as you all know, a structural trade deficit puts downward pressure on the value of your currency relative to the dollar, relative to the euro. So now you have a weaker currency. Everything you import the next morning is going to be more expensive. In other words, you import inflation, whether you're importing food or medicine or fuel or equipment for your schools and industry, everything is going to cost you more. So now this imported inflation becomes a dangerous issue. In many developing countries in the 80s, and increasingly now, you have issues of food and fuel price inflation, which can lead to social unrest unless food and fuel is subsidized by the government in order to support the working class, the poor, and protect them from this imported inflation. And simultaneously, your central bank will typically intervene to artificially stabilize the value of the currency. Hence the idea of fixed exchange rate. But a fixed exchange rate is a band-aid solution. It's a protective measure that hides the structural deficiencies that we have. So it's meant to be a temporary protection. But if you have these structural weaknesses, then your artificial fixation of the exchange rate essentially forces the central bank continuously to borrow dollars and euros and issue debt in foreign currencies in order to stabilize the exchange rate. But if you don't address the structural weaknesses, the energy deficit, the food deficit, the low value added industrialization, then your central bank or your Ministry of Finance will constantly have to accumulate more external debt denominated in foreign currencies that you don't have in the first place, and then completely reset your economic development policy to prioritize policies that attract dollars and euros to allow you to finance that external debt. And that's where the trap begins. And our argument here is that we need to address these structural weaknesses. The question becomes, how do we pay for these strategic investments? Where does the money come from in the first place? And that becomes the chicken and the egg story if we're focused on the external constraint from a traditional mainstream perspective. And this is where the MMT approach to inflation might offer some useful insights in terms of how we get out of these traps without necessarily increasing the inflation pressure. And I'll highlight this in a second. But first, let's talk about the false solutions. The mainstream economic solutions are typically austerity solutions, debt restructuring, privatized state-owned enterprises. Well, the problem is once you sell the power company, once you sell the airport, the airline, you can't privatize it again after 5 years because you have the same structural issue. You get a few $100 million, you spend them, and then you're back to the same issue. Labor market flexibility, in other words, forcing the working class to race to the bottom up to a point, because when you're told you have to remove food and fuel subsidies and you're forcing wages down and you're importing food and fuel at a much higher cost for the working class, you're setting yourself up for revolt, for a revolution. So it's up to a certain point, obviously. We're told FDI, foreign direct investment, and export-led growth. Well, the problem with these is that when you're focusing your FDI and export-led growth on low value-added manufacturing, you're again in that trap of negative terms of trade because you're importing capital equipment and technology, high value-added content, and you're exporting low value-added assembly line type of manufacturing. You're never getting out of that trap with export-led growth focused on low value added. FDI is even worse because not only you're trapped in the low value added manufacturing, but the profits from the foreign direct investment are repatriated. So you get even more pressure on your exchange rate and more extractive form of industrialization. Financial liberalization, essentially manufacturing an artificially attractive financial environment via monetary policy that essentially encourages speculation because you're offering lower taxes, you're offering lower levels of regulations than New York and London, you're offering artificially high rates of return via monetary policy. You're guaranteeing that the main people you're attracting are speculators, people who want to buy low and sell high and get out as soon as possible. We've seen this in the negative effects of this kind of policy with in the crises of the Mexican economy, the Russian economy, the South Korean economy, the South African economy, Turkey, Brazil, and so on. Not a good solution for developing countries to create a mini Wall Street and attract all the global speculation. Tourism. This is really tricky for developing countries because tourism appears to give the perfect solution, because when you bring in 10 million tourists, you create jobs in hotels and restaurants and entertainment centers. You bring foreign currency reserves because those tourists are coming typically from the global north, they're bringing dollars and euros. But if you don't have a certain degree of self-sufficiency on the energy front, on the food front, then the tourism industry may be an extractive industry in terms of net contributions of foreign currency reserves, because the 10 million tourists you're bringing in, you have to feed them. So you end up importing more food, and typically import higher quality food and drinks especially. Those 10 million tourists also, you have to transport them. You have to heat and cool the hotels when you host them, which means your energy imports increase even more. So it's only a net benefit. Tourism becomes a net benefit for countries that already have a high degree of food sovereignty, a high degree of energy sovereignty. But the majority of developing countries don't have that. So tourism becomes an additional drag on their external balance. So that's something to pay attention to. Remittances, workers, leaving the country, working in the global north, typically sending money back home. Uh, Obviously, there is foreign currency reserves coming in, but there's a huge brain drain, especially when you look at the majority of developing countries losing thousands and thousands of engineers and doctors and nurses and highly skilled workers that you actually need to build a foundation for a sustainable economic development system. So not really a solution for economic development. So we end up with a constant race to the bottom that leads to more external debt. And we're told there's no alternative. Margaret Thatcher told us that there is no alternative. It's a trap. This process of economic development, these false solutions, never get you out of this trap that I'm describing here. So a couple of examples. I picked Bolivia here, but I could have picked any other country. Just eyeballing the composition of exports from the typical developing country, it's low value added extractive industries, raw materials essentially, and then eyeballing the imports composition, it's typically much more complex products, technologically complex. So you end up with this huge mismatch between the value added content of what you export and what you import, and that's really part of the trap. And especially when the prices of the commodities that you export move in the wrong direction, not favorable to you, then your external constraint becomes even more severe. When you take this on a global scale, this mismatch between value-added content, these structural deficits that lead to these external debt constraints and the interest on the external debt, when you net out all global financial transactions between developed and developing countries, let's call them rich and poor countries, or global north and global south, we end up essentially with $2 trillion moving from the poorest countries to the richest countries annually. And this is the number here. That's the green line here. And you notice that the number is accelerating. It started right around $500 billion a year in the early 2000s and accelerates, meaning we have a neo-colonial extractive global financial architecture, international trade architecture that needs to be undone. Now, if you look at this, $2 trillion moving in the wrong direction, and today we're saying climate change is one of the biggest challenges and we need to address it, and we need to provide climate finance specifically to developing countries who have not been responsible for climate change since the Industrial Revolution. And we set up a global green climate fund in Copenhagen more than 10 years ago, with a commitment to put $100 billion a year in it. Now, I take $2 trillion from you and I promise to give you $100 billion. That's really not reasonable to begin with. But then that $100 billion fund per year ends up actually not having almost any money in it. The last time I checked, it had $8 billion in it. It becomes an insult, right? It's not even funny. So with this setting, we're not going to put a dent in climate change. We're not going to put a dent in global poverty. We're not going to put a dent in the process of economic development, the Millennium Development Goals. All of these issues will not be addressed under the current international finance and trade architecture, which is why UNCTAD, which produces some of these numbers, has been calling for redesigning the global trade and finance architecture. And that's probably one of the only agencies at the UN system that has recognized this and acknowledged this from the very beginning for decades now. When it comes to global income distribution, most of you have seen this. Again, we're not going to put a dent in this picture unless we redo the global trade and finance architecture. When it comes to the CO2 emissions responsibility, again, it's the richest people, the richest countries in the world that have caused the vast majority of the CO2 emission problems since the Industrial Revolution. And I really want to highlight the importance of this report. This picture here is from a UNEP report, the UN Environmental Program, that essentially, the name of the report is the Production Gap. You can look it up, and I'm happy to share the link later. I thought I put the link here, but it didn't appear. So what is the production gap? This UN report looked at how much we as a globe are allowed to extract and burn by the year 2040 versus how much countries are planning to extract and burn by the year 2040. And the difference is what we call the production gap. In other words, closing this gap between what we're allowed to extract and burn versus how much countries are planning to extract and burn essentially requires phasing out fossil fuels on a rapid scale immediately, not in 10 years, not in 20 years, immediately. Hence this effort that I invite all of you to join and to read the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And it's called the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, if you want the full title, which has been signed by thousands of people, diplomats, cities around the world have endorsed the treaty initiative. The Dalai Lama, thousands of faith leaders from around the world have endorsed it, and we're really not going to put a dent on the climate front unless we take rapid action on this front. Then the question becomes, well, how do we transform the economy? How do we pay for this transformation if we really need to do all of this on a rapid scale? Isn't it going to be highly inflationary for governments to spend hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars on this new renewable energy infrastructure technology, kind of redoing the entire system? This is where the MMT insights on how much fiscal policy space each country is able to contribute, and what is the real constraint to how much countries can spend, the inflation constraint. So going back to the spectrum of monetary sovereignty, again, you have most developing countries on the weaker end of the monetary sovereignty spectrum. And the good news is that the countries that have been responsible the most for CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution happen to be countries with high degrees of monetary sovereignty. Countries that have not been responsible for climate change are on the weaker end of the spectrum. So to kind of summarize the issues here, the Global South, low degree of monetary sovereignty, not responsible for climate change, has extremely high levels of external debt for the majority of countries, has low productive capacity, in other words, capacity to produce renewable energy infrastructure, to produce high value added content, manufacturing, and so on, low research and development capacity, which can be changed, and suffers from neo-colonial extractive economic systems, that $2 trillion that moves to the global north that I described earlier. On the other hand, the global north has a high degree of monetary sovereignty, has been responsible for climate change. We're talking here about a climate debt that needs to be repaid, has low to no external debt to speak of for the majority of countries in the global north, has very high productive capacity, high research and development capacity, and benefits from a neo-colonial extractive system. So when you lay out the picture in this way, the only transformative solution that I can think of here, that many others have thought of, obviously, is reparations. Reparations for colonial debt, for neo-colonial debt, reparations for climate debt. And when I say reparations, we usually mean three things. Number one, acknowledging the damage. And I think the evidence is overwhelming. And once you acknowledge the damage, and you commit to repairing the damage, and you offer a public apology typically for the damage, repairing the damage is not simply a monetary compensation, a transfer from the countries of the global north to the countries of the global south. Yes, monetary compensation is part of the reparations, but it's not the only step, and it's not the most important part. The most important part of reparations is actually repairing the broken structures. In other words, repairing the global finance and trade architecture that sucks $2 trillion a year, repairing the broken system of energy production, repairing the broken system of agricultural production, the food sovereignty aspect in the global south, repairing the distribution of manufacturing units that's so biased towards high value added content in the global north, low value added, low cost manufacturing in the global south. That's not a sustainable system ecologically, socially, politically, economically. That's what we mean by reparations, repairing these broken structures. And of course, it does take financial resources to repair the damage. That's why reparations is both structural reparations and monetary compensation for the damage. There's other aspects of reparations that I'm happy to discuss later, which includes, scientific, cultural heritage appropriation from indigenous communities in the global south and so on, especially by pharmaceutical companies, fashion companies, design companies, and so on. So those are secondary issues, but these are the primary issues that I would like us to pay attention to. So here we're talking about a global Green New Deal. The question is, can we afford it? Who's going to pay for it? Especially developing countries, how are they going to pay for structural transformations? And even in the global north, people say, well, how can we pay for this very expensive program? So here's how most people typically think about how much we can spend safely without causing inflation. And here I'm talking about the mainstream of economics and politics. We're told that, well, governments need to collect taxes in order to spend. Governments can borrow up to a certain point, but beyond that, any additional spending will cause inflation. Too much government deficit, too much government debt. In other words, we're told there's really very little we can do to fight climate change or poverty or any of these structural issues. It's whatever we can tax, whatever markets allow us to borrow, and that's it. That's the limit. MMT is essentially saying there's this additional spending capacity that most countries have, and it's not the same level of spending capacity. Countries with a very high degree of monetary sovereignty will have a much larger additional spending capacity, and developing countries with very low degrees of monetary sovereignty will have very limited spending capacity. And notice the constraint here. We're not saying this is an infinite level of spending. There's always the inflation risk, which is the ultimate constraint. In other words, our focus now becomes, what is this additional spending capacity? Where is the inflation risk? And how can we determine what are the driving forces behind the inflation the inflation risk, and how can we tame or eliminate or push further and further out this inflation risk? Because if we push the inflation risk further out, we expand this additional spending capacity. So the focus becomes on the real limit. So what determines the risk of inflation? Two things. Number one, the lack of productive capacity, logistics, supply chains, disruption. By real productive capacity, we mean skills, technology, raw materials, and so on. The good news about this component of inflation risk is that productive capacity is producible, skills are producible, logistics and supply chains are producible. So with strategic investments in key areas where we have lack of productive capacity, whether it's on the skills front, on the technology front, or on the materials front, we can actually increase productive capacity, and as a result, push the risk of inflation further and further out. So you create millions of jobs potentially by spending strategically in these areas, and you reduce the risk of inflation rather than increase it. Whereas in the mainstream thinking, any additional spending will automatically cause inflation. Here we're saying if you focus the strategic spending in areas that actually increase productive capacity in strategic areas, you can actually reduce the risk of inflation over time. So that's point number one. Point number two has to do with the abusive market power and price setting behavior of key players in the economy. In other words, you have cartels or monopolies or price setters in strategic industries who can raise prices simply because they can. And this kind of inflation risk, you can't eliminate it with austerity. You can only eliminate it by taxing and regulating this abusive market power out of existence. In other words, you democratize these industries. In other words, you regulate, you use antitrust laws, you update your antitrust laws in order to make those markets more competitive. You fight corruption, in other words, because typically the lawmakers who have the power to regulate and tax and eliminate this abuse of market power are typically funded via campaign donations by these oligarchs or these cartels. So this becomes really a question of democracy. And you can't really separate the question of democracy from inflation, from economic development issues. So if we acknowledge these two sources of inflation pressure points and identify for each country will have different key players, will have different strategic weaknesses and strength. And if we invest strategically to increase this production, this additional spending capacity, then you can spend more without necessarily causing inflation. But it all has to be strategic, not just any spending. And doing the spending on productive capacity without tackling corruption and abusive price setting behavior doesn't give us a good solution either. You have to do both simultaneously. Otherwise, the risk of inflation will always materialize, and that will be the real constraint on how much each country can do. And in this space, of course, countries with much higher degree of monetary sovereignty will have a better time managing this additional spending capacity. And it's really going to be the developing countries with the component of reparations that need to build this additional spending capacity by building strategic productive capacity in food, in energy, and transforming industry from low value added manufacturing to a higher and higher level of value added content manufacturing. That's really the paradigm shift that the MMT framework is putting on the table for us to consider. On the inflation front, I really need to spend a minute or two on the mainstream approach to inflation targeting. This is not my words. This is the Fed itself acknowledging that the Fed has no reliable theory of inflation. All the inflation targeting of the last 10 years since 2008, 2010 has been a disaster. This is the EU trying to do inflation targeting for 10 years. It's not even funny. So here's what I'm going to close with these a couple of slides here, 3 slides. What I'm suggesting is that we increase government spending to fight inflation, which from a mainstream perspective, increasing government spending to fight inflation, that's like standard textbook. If you increase government spending, you're going to have more inflation. Well, hear me out. Here's the mainstream approach. Here's the logic that says increasing government spending will actually cause inflation, not reduce inflation. I'm using the example of my home country here, Tunisia. Let's say in this scenario, Tunisia wants to spend 2 billion dinars on health and education, transportation, whatever sectors. And here I emphasize 2 billion dinars in the national currency, not dollars, not money borrowed from abroad. This is deficit spending in the national currency. Here's what the mainstream approach will say. Well, you're going to have more imports of food, energy, medical equipment. You're going to have a larger trade deficit. You're going to have a weaker exchange rate because of that trade deficit. You're going to have an inflation pass-through effect, even hyperinflation if you continue doing this for many years. You're going to have more external debt because your central bank is going to try to, stabilize the exchange rate. The IMF and foreign lenders will mandate spending cuts, so we're back to austerity. And you're going to have less investment in health and education, back to square one. You're going to have more unemployment, more brain drain, social, economic, political tensions, and there is no alternative. That's the mainstream approach. And Margaret Thatcher again told us, there is no alternative. You can't deficit spend your way out of poverty. You have to follow kind of market discipline rules and let the private sector do the work. Any government spending that adds to the deficit, to the national debt, will cause inflation. Well, here's the MMT approach. I'm going to use the exact same example. 2 billion dinars in deficit spending, not foreign currency, but now spent under a different framework. So now we're going to spend 1 billion dinars on health and education instead of 2 billion dinars. And then 1 billion will be spent on increasing domestic productive capacity of food, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and crack down on corruption, abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation. So the exact same amount of spending, 2 billion dinars, but now spread more strategically with complementary policies. Here's the effect. You're going to have fewer imports of food and energy. You're going to have a lower trade deficit. You're going to have a more stable or even stronger exchange rate. No inflation pass-through effect. You're going to have lower external debt and higher credit rating by credit agencies. And you're going to increase your foreign currency reserves at the central bank. You're going to have more resilience to external shocks because of the food and energy security that you're building. You're going to have a lower carbon footprint, excuse me, more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for all. Now we're talking. So we're spending more in order to fight inflation as opposed to spending more to cause inflation. Now the question becomes, for the case of Tunisia here that I use, is the real limit 2 billion dinars? Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4.5, maybe it's 7. What determines how much deficit this country can have in its national currency? It's not the amount per se, but it's the capacity of the government to manage and govern this additional bureaucracy, this additional logistical challenge, the availability of real resources, skilled people, the logistics and supply chains constraint, the capacity to tackle corruption and fight abuse in the system. That's what determines whether the limit is 2 billion dinars, 4 billion dinars, or 7 billion dinars. So once you discover the key inflation pressure points and you target them strategically via spending to add productive capacity, spending to add strategic skills, and spending to tackle corruption and abuse, then the real limit becomes not balancing the budget per se, but the limit becomes managing that risk of inflation and pushing it further and further out. And as a result, increasing the government's fiscal policy space without having to necessarily resort to external financing, especially in strategic areas like this. And then the last slide here that I have for you is on the industrial strategies part, because yes, we can understand the importance of agriculture and we can maybe manage that. We can understand the importance of energy, but what do you do with the industrial sector in a small developing country of say 10 or 15 million people? You can't really industrialize without facing the challenge of economies of scale and without participating in the global economy. So here we're not going to go back to the 50s and 60s and redo the entire system, but there are ways to build strategic South-South partnerships in order to industrialize under different terms and conditions. So the key idea here of South-South strategic partnerships, take a block of 20 countries, could be neighboring countries or not necessarily neighboring countries, but countries that have access to larger markets that actually allow you to have economies of scale. So instead of a market of 10 million consumers, now you have a market of 300 million consumers. Now you can industrialize, you can hit these economies of scale. You focus on having complementary resources and capabilities. I'll give you an example in the renewable energy front. It's not only about acquiring renewable energy technology by importing it, but here we're talking about building industries that can actually manufacture and deploy renewable energy infrastructure. If you take that block of 20 or 30 countries that happen to have all the raw materials for building solar panels, for example, then the question becomes, do we have the labor skills, the engineering capacity to develop this industry? Do we have the technology, or do we need technological partnerships, say with Germany or with China or with the United States, in order to industrialize internally within this block? So focus on complementary resources and capabilities and strategic areas, and start building those horizontal linkages to increase the value added content that you retain within this trading block of South-South strategic partnership. Focus on collective resilience. Start with food sovereignty, start with renewable energy sovereignty, water security, education, training, healthcare, transportation. Start with the key building blocks for your economy. And this is how a country acquires a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. It's not something that you declare, it's something that you acquire via these strategic investments that give you more and more resilience to external shocks. If a country or regional bloc lacks this basic level of resilience, it has no bargaining chips. it can't walk away from a negotiation table, whether it's trade negotiations or anything else, and it will continue to lose its economic and monetary sovereignty over time. So to conclude, monetary sovereignty is a spectrum. High degrees of monetary sovereignty can be acquired via MMT-informed strategic investments, similar to what I highlighted here. We have less than 10 years to go on the climate front, and to be honest, on so many other issues. The climate crisis, health, inequality, poverty, socioeconomic exclusion, injustice, all of these crises call for bold and transformative, urgent actions, not slow and incremental actions, not doing more of the same policies that we did for the last 50 years. So the current climate and jobs policies are too weak, too slow, too expensive, and ineffective. And in the context of the climate challenge, they're really dangerous, the current policies that we're following. An MMT-informed global Green New Deal with climate and colonial reparations as a core component of redoing the global trade and finance architecture is possible, desirable, and affordable. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Fadhel, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, so thank you so much. It was a great presentation. And if you have some more time to stay with us, we will collect some questions. Okay, is it okay?
Perfect. Yeah, looking forward to it.
If any of you have questions, I will stay here. We can collect questions. My suggestion would be for you to come here, right in front. Then he can directly see you. What about it? Questions? You can come, please. Here.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your very wonderful presentation. I'm Christine. I'm from the Philippines, and I currently work with the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. So the intersection of development finance and climate finance is something that is very close to our work. And I fully agree, and I appreciate that you brought the point about the importance of recognizing these power relations in the global political economy and addressing the urgency of action in climate change. And first, while I believe that it's tremendously important to insist upon our governments in developing countries to embark on this paradigm shift of transforming the productive structure and minimizing inflation risks, this is something that may take, say, 5 to 10 years to materialize, I would say at the minimum, especially for our country, since we don't have a very large industrial base. So to me, it seems that you're right. The core of addressing climate change really rests upon reparations. And that when you mentioned that countries with larger fiscal space and higher monetary sovereignty are those like the US and Japan, these are also the countries that are most resistant to urgent climate action, such that Japan continues to fund fossil fuels, and the United States, of course, we all know how resistant they are to transformation on the global scale, at least that would weaken their economic position. So I wonder then, are there any options that we have on the global scale, especially in terms of economic pressure, that would compel countries like the United States and Japan to take advantage of their fiscal space and provide the necessary reparations for developing countries? So yes, that's it. That's the
Very good question. Thank you, Christine.
Fadhel?
Yes.
how do you prefer for us to manage? We can collect one, or we can collect a couple of questions and then you respond?
I can quickly answer this question, and in the meanwhile, I would invite the next person or group of people to line up and prepare their questions. But this is a very important issue. So what I try to highlight in my work is that we're not gonna address any of these issues unless, number one, we acknowledge that we can't separate the issue of economic development from energy policy, from climate policy. The three are interlinked. And in the current international negotiations, for example, when you go to the COP meetings every November, they usually tell you, no, we're here to talk about CO2 emissions and climate change. We're not talking about energy. We're not going to talk about economic development. Go to the IMF and World Bank and talk about economic development. Go to other agencies. We have other events for those things. So they silo these issues. And by doing that, they dismantle the process that I'm trying to put together here in this presentation. So number one, we have to acknowledge that these are interlinked. You can't do climate change policy without changing the engine of economic development. And the mainstream of the economics profession and public policy is not willing to question the engines of economic development. If anything, they tell you need more of it. You need more FDI, you need more export-oriented growth, you need more tourism. And what I try to demonstrate is that these are false solutions. These are things that keep us in this trap. So how can we change this? I mean, you have to educate, inform, mobilize, empower people to change the terms of the debate. So that's why I emphasize this is really a question of democracies. This is not just a question for the elites to negotiate in government meetings or international meetings. So empowering not only the young generation of economists like you, but also grassroots organizations, people who are on our side, who are fighting for justice, who are fighting for climate change, but don't necessarily see the connections in this approach and are not coherent enough, I would argue, in providing a coherent, complete alternative under the umbrella of reparations, and calling their bluff when they say, no, reparations is going to be inflationary, no, reparations is not going to work. So having a coherent framework for grassroots organizations, for academic, intellectual communities to fight on a united front, I think is our only way out. And here I recognize I'm optimistic because the time is not in our favor, but I can't think of any other coherent framework other than what I'm presenting here. And I emphasize again, nothing that I presented here is really my innovation. I just put together core concepts from different intellectual communities on the reparations front, on the development front, on the kind of monetary policy and fiscal policy front, the MMT and post-Keynesian community, trying to put together a coherent macro global framework that allows us to finance this transformation without causing hyperinflations, and financing this transformation in a just way for developing countries, because we're all in this together. It's not like the global north is going to make it and the global south is going to sink. This is a global issue that all of us are facing. So I hope this answers your question, Christine. I'm happy to continue this conversation offline as well.
More questions? Okay, you have one more at least.
Yeah. Hi, Professor. My name is Eduardo. Yeah, it's about China. You know, we're speaking there. I would like to have your views about China, because in somehow regarding this issue of climate change is one of the biggest player, China, India. And where are we now? This is the first question. Second one, you know, I've been putting since we started yesterday. It's like the Latin America, particularly in Brazil, there's this view that we have to create a kind of monetary union. So, you know, Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela, they're heterogeneous economy, but in somehow there's a space where they can converge in terms of monetary union. I would like to have you review. And maybe it would be linked with this the current crisis in terms of supply chain, where most of the production, particularly from the West, will be driven to some friend countries in Latin America. So we are living in different environment now, economic environment. So I would like to have your views from these three topics: China, monetary unions, and also about supply chain. Thank you.
Very good questions. Thank you, Eduardo. So on China and India, in terms of CO2 emissions, yes, they're major emitters in the last 20 years, especially the last 10 years. But the kind of split that I vaguely presented today between countries that have been responsible for CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolutions versus developing countries, China and India are major contributors in the last 2 decades especially. But if you look at the consumption of the output that China and India is producing, it's also mostly done in the global north. So there are ways, and there are some colleagues and some scholars who developed some useful metric to actually identify who's responsible for which component of CO2 emissions. And this way, the reparations components can be done fairly, not based on just who's emitting the most, but also who's responsible for consuming products that have generated those emissions. And that brings us back to global north and global south being really the split. The second question about monetary union is really interesting, because we have similar questions about monetary unions in some parts of Africa. Is this going to be the way to change the process of economic development? Again, I would highlight the 3 strategic or structural deficiencies. It doesn't really help anybody for 20 countries to create a monetary union when all 20 countries struggle with the same issues of lack of food sovereignty, lack of energy sovereignty, and all 20 countries specialize in low value added manufacturing. I'm okay with the monetary union if it comes under the umbrella of strategic transformation of the trading bloc to build resilience on the food front. So building a food sovereignty system for the bloc of 20 countries, building an energy sovereignty system, renewable energy sovereignty system for the bloc of 20 countries, and building a new strategy for industrialization that focuses on that collective resilience within the bloc. But creating a monetary union without structurally addressing those weaknesses is going to be, we're all going to be struggling together, as opposed to we're all struggling individually. So that's my comment on that. On the supply chain issues, obviously we've had some serious issues since the beginning of the COVID crisis with supply chains that was followed by the Russia and Ukraine conflict that affected food, raw materials from Russia and Ukraine, and energy prices globally. What this has revealed is that the process of globalization that we've pursued in the last several decades, that was focused on just-in-time supply chains as opposed to just-in-case supply chains, that was focused on what some people call the lean and mean supply chains and kind of corporate model. Now we're paying the price for this in terms of us having minimized our resilience to these disruptions, our resilience to these external shocks. So what we're seeing right now, primarily by the US and the EU, and to some extent some Asian countries, is rethinking of this form of globalization by bringing either closer to home the strategic supply chain components like microchips, for example, or investing more in securing a much more resilient supply chain to these strategic industries. My concern here is, as the world leaders, the EU, the US, and so on, are rethinking their supply chains, what is the role that the global South sees for itself? What is the role that Africa sees for itself, for example? That's really where we have a lack of focus in the global South, where there's this famous phrase, if you don't have a strategic vision for yourself, you're going to be part of somebody else's strategic vision. And right now, the countries that have strategic visions for the next 50 to 100 years, in terms of restructuring their power position economically and geopolitically, it's the EU, it's the US, it's Russia, it's China, it's Japan. The rest of the global south is really focused on these immediate crises. Are we able to pay the salaries for the teachers at the end of the month? Nobody's focused on long-term strategic positioning. And that's really where it's extremely important for the global south to reposition itself, or think strategically about repositioning itself within the global economy as we're going through this massive transformation that's going to unfold in the next decade. So very good questions. Thank you, Eduardo.
So again, Fadhel, I'm going to check if we have more questions. If you have more time to spend with us? Okay. Please.
Thank you, Professor, for the interesting talk. I have a question on when you talked about the additional spending capacity. So I wonder how the additional spending capacity would be financed, whether by further borrowing or on markets, or by government, central bank financing of deficits. And the second question regards the anti-inflationary policies. I think it's very interesting what we saw at least in the global north, the way in which governments are combating inflation for the first time. It's not only with monetary policy tightening, but the anti-inflationary pact in the US, and also many initiatives in Europe that are using industrial policy, antitrust policy to address inflation. But this is what this didn't happen in the global south, where the monetary policy tightening cycle started more than a year ago. So does also the way in which inflation can be not prevented but cured depends on the monetary sovereignty and on the capacity to create additional spending? Thank you.
Very good question. So yes, you see a little bit more of the MMT influence in the public discourse lately on the inflation. How do you fight inflation? The traditional mainstream approach to fighting inflation is reduce government spending, balance budgets, and have the central bank raise interest rates. So in the US, we sort of have a mix of these things. The central bank is raising interest rates as if that's going to address, when you look at the US strictly, and I'll go back to the global south in a second, if the actual sources of inflation have to do with supply chain disruptions related to COVID, mostly supply chain disruptions coming from the Asian manufacturing base in China primarily, logistical shipping disruptions, kind of a big traffic jam in the oceans. How is raising the interest rates in the US going to unclog the supply chains in China? How is raising the interest rate in the US going to end the conflict in the Ukraine, which is fueling the inflation pressure points on the energy front, on the food front, on the raw materials front because of the sanctions on Russia and so on. So that's the misleading part of the fighting inflation front. But on the kind of fiscal side, which is where MMT focuses its attention, fighting inflation by building a more resilient supply chain, yes, that will reduce the inflation pressure points. Not immediately, because these things take time. Fighting abusive market power of pharmaceuticals is going to reduce the inflation pressure point on the health sector. But of course, it's not going to happen immediately, because even this anti-inflation fiscal program that Biden just signed yesterday is not going to kick in for another several years. So these are the things that should have been done years ago. But in the long term, they will have an impact. In the global south, unfortunately, most of the focus has been on the role of the central bank in fighting inflation and austerity policies, which is the worst combination you can have in the global context of the Fed and other major central banks raising interest rates. So we're about to enter a phase very similar to the mid-1980s global South debt crisis, because now it's going to be more difficult for developing countries to finance or refinance their external deficit. Central banks, like in my own country, Tunisia, raising the interest rate in order to fight inflation, when the actual source of inflation in the case of Tunisia is wheat imports and natural gas imports. These are the major pressure points of inflation, and abusive market power by internal and external cartels that dominate the economy. So the central bank raising interest rate is simply going to kill domestic investment, is going to fuel speculation, it's not going to even touch any of the inflation pressure points. So that's the sad story about what many developing countries unfortunately are doing. They're sticking tighter and tighter to the mainstream textbook approach to fighting inflation, when countries like the US are actually moving away from the textbook prescriptions, not completely, but at least using the fiscal policy tools to tackle some of the key inflation pressure points, and yet at the same time still claiming that the central bank is fighting inflation by raising interest rates. So I hope it answers your question. Thank you.
Anyone else? So, okay, so I think it's time for us to say thank you again, Fadhel. It was a wonderful presentation, lots of insights, lots of information. So
thank you.
That's
My
it.
pleasure. I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions. You have my email, my information. I'm happy to share the slides if anybody wants them. And this is recorded, so we'll share the recording later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.